Hello, friends, and welcome to Service of Change's Changecast, your podcast for change. I'm your host, Dennis Snappy II, with Service of Change, where small changes among the masses can be a massive impact around the world. Tonight, crimes against the educators. Alex Newman, journalist and author, advocate for education. He's going to get into some really, really deep stuff, the history behind what's going on with our broken and, in my opinion, corrupt system of education that is ruining and damaging the future of America and the world. But before we do that, before we get into that discussion with Alex, let me bring on my esteemed co-host. When he's not wrapping food for delivery, he's rapping about life, Joel, the provocateur Schaefer. Joel, what's going on tonight, dude?
You always throw me off a little with it. You spin the introduction a little bit.
I try to make it, interesting, keep you on your toes.
I know, it was cool. I do rap food.
You do.
I also rap, so WRAP as well as RAP.
I get a little poetic sometimes.
No, it's cool. No, I'm doing incredibly well. I'm excited for tonight's show, and I'm just ready to get into it whenever you are.
Yeah, we have some good stuff, man. But before we do that, actually, let us say hello to Miss Lori, who's handling our social media feeds. At Lori Latimer 1, Dennis Snappy II, NAPPIII, and at Service of Change. Lori, are you with us this evening?
Yes, sir, I am.
Lori.
Lori, how are you?
I feel really good tonight. I feel confident and optimistic.
I like those words. I like that energy that you're bringing to us. How's life as a published poet? We're coming up on the first month of you being a published poet.
It feels. I still feel kind of self-conscious about it at times, but I just continue to get good feedback. Like, I've sold, copies to a number of my coworkers, and they come back to me and tell me, how, they found, the work meaningful and really enjoyed it. And, they could just buy it and, use it as a coaster. They don't need to come back and
give you that feedback
to me. So that's been really encouraging. So
that's nice. I'm glad that you're getting that feedback, and it's well-deserved feedback. We just published Lori's book on May 2nd, The Art of Service, a collection of haiku poems. It's $6.99 for the hard copy and 90 cents for the Kindle version. I highly recommend it. You can see the links for it at serviceofchange.com. Lori's an advocate for change, as we are here at Service of Change. So please check it out. It's well worth the small investment, and it's going to support Lori and the Service of Change community. So please consider checking that out. So, Lori, not cutting you short, but I want to move into something real quick before we bring our guest on. I'm a part of a campaign this week. It started this past Monday. For those of you looking on the YouTube page, let me bring that up in a second. There we go. Man, I'm struggling. Okay. So it's called Military and Veterans. It's Memorial Day 2015, Gone but Not Forgotten. I was a part of this organization for Veterans Day, and what it is, it's a collection of military authors, veteran authors, and we're pledging our proceeds, 100% of our proceeds, to a veterans charity of our choice. So you can go to the link. The links are up at servicechange.com. I have an article linked right there at the top in our news feed slide at the very top of the page. And it'll give you more details about this. But I'm pledging 100% royalties on all of my books. I have 4 books that are up through Amazon. You can get them all at the servicechange.com website. And 100% of the royalties that I make, between last Monday and I think tomorrow or Saturday, I'm pledging that to StopSoldierSuicide.org. They've got some great resources available for soldiers facing suicide and mental health issues. They just put a call center in place that they're staffing, trying to staff 24/7, doing some great things because we're losing 22 soldiers a day, and 22 a day is 22 too many for our nation's military. So please check that out. If you're not interested in my books, then go to the website. There's a book in there for everybody. Summer's coming up. You want to do your summer reading. Of course, I encourage you to check out some of the books that I've written that Service of Change has put out. But you're well entitled to check something else out. But you're getting a good book, and you're supporting our veterans. So just wanted to get that little commercial there. Please check that out. Let me jump back into our PowerPoint presentation. Actually, we're going to bring our guest on now. So let's do that now. So, Mr. Alex Newman, educator and author. He's an international journalist, educator, author, and consultant. In addition to serving as president of the small media and information consulting firm Liberty Sentinel Media, he writes for a wide array of publications in the United States and abroad. He currently serves as a foreign correspondent for the New American Magazine and contributor to WND and more. He's also written for numerous newspapers and magazines such as the Gainesville Sun, Liberty Magazine, Crisis Magazine, the Diplomat Magazine, and many more. In addition, he has co-authored 2 books, including a major expose of the plot to dumb down American children using government schools, published by WND Books, that hit stores on April 14th. For the last 4 years, Alex has been teaching advanced economics in to high school seniors through Freedom Project Education, an accredited K-12 school offering a classical education based in Judeo-Christian values. Before that, he worked for the Leadership Institute. He also spent time working in marketing and branding. Alex has a BS degree in journalism from the University of Florida with an emphasis on economics and international relations, as well as an AA degree in foreign languages from Miami-Dade College. Alex has lived in 7 countries: US, Mexico, Brazil, Switzerland, France, South Africa, Sweden, on 4 continents, and speaks multiple languages fluently. His work has been cited by governments and major media outlets around the world, and Alex is a frequent guest on radio shows, TV programs, and at conferences. Along with his family, he currently splits his time between various places, including Europe and the United States. That is quite an impressive resume. Let's see if he's with us now. Alex, are you with us, my friend?
I'm here. Thanks very much for having me, guys.
There he is. Alex, that's a great background you have, man. You're a busy guy.
Thanks very much. It probably looks better on paper than it is in real life.
Well, it looks pretty good right now from where we're standing. So, great stuff, man. Great stuff. So, how you doing this evening?
Doing great, and I'm happy to be here with you guys. And great stuff you're doing, and really happy to see what you're doing for the veterans there. That was a really nice plug there. So, thanks for everything you guys are doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So let's get into this a little bit. You know, you've got this book out that you co-authored, and it's called Crimes Against the Educators. What's the inspiration behind this? I'm going to jump right into it. What's your inspiration for putting this out here?
Well, really, the genesis of this got started more than 50 years ago. My co-author, Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, I'm actually here visiting with him right now because he's probably going to be leaving us very shortly. But he found out 50 years ago, he read Why Johnny Can't Read by Rudolph Flesch. And basically what this little book exposed, just an amateur, he figured out that the government schools were teaching children to read English as if it were Chinese. So, rather than using the read, which he speaks because we have a phonetic alphabet that's just obvious. And so Dr. Blumenfeld figured out that they were teaching the kids to read English using this thing called the whole word method and the look-say method, or the sight method. They have different names to conceal this agenda. But in a nutshell, that's how it began. He figured out about this. He was outraged about it. He realized that the literacy crisis was growing. And, I think any honest and reasonable person would be outraged to figure out that the government schools that we're paying for with our tax dollars are teaching children to read in a way that deliberately causes lifelong reading disabilities and produces illiteracy and other problems, and even actual brain damage, as we show in the book. Modern neuroscience and brain scans show that people who learn how to read with this whole word method that they're using in government schools, they actually have physical brain damage that you don't have in children who learned how to read using phonics, which is, again, the correct way to read. So that's really where Sam got started with this 50 years ago, and since then he's written 10 books on education. My story is a little bit different. I found out probably in 2011, 2012 maybe, that the federal government was trying to bribe all the states into imposing Common Core, this crazy national curriculum. And so I immediately was very interested. I had been interested in education for a long time, and I was teaching at the time. I still am teaching high school students in a private school. And so I became very, very interested in this. And then I was familiar with Sam's work. We've written for a lot of the same publications, and I knew he had done some really groundbreaking work in this field. I mean, just really, he's a pioneer, a giant in this field. And so when I figured out he was working on a book, and the publisher contacted me to see if I was interested in working on it, I said, absolutely, sign me up. I would be more than happy to do it. because again, Sam is a genius, and I was very interested in education, and so that's how we decided, hey, we need to expose what's going on here. These are crimes being perpetrated against our children with our tax money, and it needs to be exposed because the consequences are going to be devastating, not just to the individual children who are being destroyed by this, but to our nation and to our liberties and really to the whole world.
You know, you touched on so many points that are very personal to me. You know, you and I spoke a little bit about my background and what we've been through. I just want to jump back for a minute. You talked about teaching whole word versus phonics. Can you explain briefly to our listeners who aren't in education maybe whole word teaching is, how that works, or with sight words?
Sure. Basically, what they're doing now, and this is part of Common Core, and this is happening in government schools all across this country. You know, there's a few renegade teachers who still do it the correct way, and they defy the federal government and the state government and the local school board. But basically, what they're doing with this method of teaching how to read, the simplest way to explain it is they're teaching English as if it were Chinese. So rather than the way that you read using phonics is you understand that every letter has a sound associated with it. So an A can be a or a. And so that's how you learn how to read the English language. The way they're doing it now, they're teaching the kids to memorize entire words, lists of words, and this sounds ridiculous to a normal person. They say no one would ever teach someone to read like that because that just doesn't make any sense. But that's what's happening. And maybe a lot of the listeners here who don't like reading or who have so-called reading disabilities, this might be ringing some bells here. But they're teaching kids to read words in English as if they were a symbol. So, you know, in Chinese, for example, you have a character, a symbol, and that represents a whole word. So you look at the symbol and you associate that symbol with a concept or an idea or a thing or whatever the case may be. But, you know, that's an entirely different type of writing that they have in China. We have a much more advanced, in my opinion, alphabet because we can basically put any sound, any word onto paper, and we can spell it with our phonetic alphabet. And so this was a huge advancement, and now the government schools have taken it backwards for a very deliberate purpose. And so, again, this causes brain damage, and this can be shown in brain scans. And it was all part of a deliberate plan. It wasn't some kind of huge national accident that they ended up getting this into all the government schools. You know, this method was developed in the 1840s, the whole word method, by a reverend, and he wanted to teach deaf children how to read. And that's a very noble goal. Deaf children cannot hear sounds, and so you need to figure out a new way to teach them how to read. So, in a sense, that was really a great development. You know, now we can teach deaf people how to read the English language, even though they can't hear the sounds and associate them with letters and so on.
Right.
But when you try this on, students who can hear, who otherwise would be learning how to read with phonics, the results are a disaster. And this was tried in the 1840s in the Boston public school system, and it was such a disaster that it was pulled out within a few years. So this was known to be quackery. In terms of teaching regular everyday students who aren't deaf how to read, as far back as the 1840s. And it kind of died after that. You know, maybe they were still teaching deaf children to read this way because that makes sense. But it was revived around the turn of the century. So around 1898 is when John Dewey said, hey, we should reintroduce this into the schools. He didn't like high literacy. He wanted to dumb down the children. And his motivations were very explicit as well. He told us what he wanted to.
Did we just lose Alex?
Yeah, I think we lost him for a second. Alex, you still with us?
What he can happen elective is.
We lost you for a second, Alex. I'm sorry. Last we heard was John Dewey told us what he wanted to do.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so John Dewey, he was very clear and explicit in what he wanted to do. He wanted to transform the United States from what he considered to be an individualistic and free market-oriented, capitalistic, selfish society into a socialistic, collectivist utopia. And he even pointed to the model that he wanted to see in the United States. It was an 1888 novel published by Edward Bellamy called Looking Backward. And this was a fantasy of a communist America in the year 2000. And John Dewey thought that would be spectacular, but he knew we would never get there as long as we had high literacy, critical thinking, extremely well-educated population. And so he set out to dumb down the children, and his chief tool to accomplish that was destroying the literacy of the American people by first and foremost, changing the way that reading was taught in the government schools.
You know, if I wasn't a teacher and I'd hear some of the stuff that you're saying, if I wasn't in the position that I'm in, I would dismiss what you're saying as a crazy conspiracy theory. Now, I haven't done the research that you've done and the work that you've done put into this book, but one of the things I keep saying as a teacher is, how can the policymakers keep allowing these decisions to go through when they are an obvious detriment to the education of our students? And that's what has me completely baffled, is that the things they're doing don't benefit the kids. Literacy rates continue to go down. Reading levels are absolutely atrocious for kids, and they just keep pushing, we got to pass the test and close the achievement gap. But that's not going to improve education. So to our listeners out there who aren't sure how to take this, whether you're thinking it's some kind of conspiracy theory or not, that is what's happening right now. I mean, would you agree with me, Alex?
Oh, absolutely, Dennis. And you know, the government's own figures bear this out. If you look back at the founding of our country, John Adams, for example, he said an American who can't read is as rare as a comet or an earthquake. Thomas Jefferson, our second president, he said, he bragged that America was the only country in the world where the farmers read Homer. So, you know, 200 years ago, 250 years ago, America was extremely literate. I mean, literacy was practically universal. Everybody had to learn how to read. And, you know, this was very clear in the colony's education laws. Everybody must learn how to read so that everybody can read their Bible. So everybody learned how to read. If you look at the situation today, according to the federal government's own data, they did a literacy survey in 1993, for example, and they found that 55% of Americans can barely read. So we spend almost $1 trillion on education now every year, and you're telling me we can't teach children how to read? I taught my 4-year-old how to read in a matter of weeks using phonics. So the notion that this is some kind of accident is preposterous. And what we do in the book is we use primary source documents to show that this is exactly what happened. So the conspiracy theory, that's an interesting term, and Dr. Blumenfeld and I spent a lot of time talking about whether this is actually a conspiracy, because a conspiracy has 3 elements to it. First of all, it has to be more than one person. This certainly qualifies. There were many people involved in this, not just John Dewey. He got money from the Rockefellers. He had a lot of colleagues at Teachers College, Columbia University, etc., the University of Chicago. So in that sense, it qualifies. Point number 2, it has to be malicious or illegal.
We lost them again, didn't we?
Think you faded out again, Alex.
On the pop. It has to be.
Alex, I'm so sorry, man. We lost you again for a second. We're having a tough connection tonight. We heard point number 2, and then you cut out. So let's jump back to that.
Okay, sure. Point number 2 is that it has.
Man, this doesn't like point number 2.
Point number 4 is that
mobile intimidation of a nation.
Hey, Alex, I'm so sorry, buddy. Every time you say point number 2, you cut out, man. I don't think the universe likes what you're about to say.
Okay. Well, just stop me if it cuts out, and I will just start back where I left off. But
yeah.
Point number 2 in the definition of a conspiracy is wicked, malicious, or illegal intent.
Okay.
And I would argue, and Dr. Blumenfeld argues, and I think any reasonable person would conclude, that a plan to dumb down the population of a nation for the purpose of overthrowing their government and overthrowing their liberties is absolutely evil in intent. And then the third point, to become a conspiracy, it has to be secret. And so that's where we can have some debate here. Was this secret? Well, it wasn't that secret because we have the primary source documents. We reprinted one of John Dewey's essays in our book where he talks about, hey, we have to do this quietly, we have to do it slowly, change must come gradually, because if we go too quickly, there's going to be a violent reaction, and it's going to jeopardize the success of our enterprise here. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the word conspiracy is interesting, and we spent a long time thinking about whether this is or is not a conspiracy. We can debate whether it fits the definition. I think it comes pretty close. The only question is whether this was really a secret, and, you know, it must not have been, because we have the primary source documents showing that this is what they were planning to do.
Right, and I mean, a lot of times this stuff hides in plain sight anyway, because they know most people aren't going to go out and look at it, and the people that do, they get labeled as crazy conspiracy theorists anyway, so it kind of, you know, keeps it hidden, you know, from everybody anyway. So now, take me from John Dewey, who you know, is saying these things, to today? I mean, who are the players involved today that if this is an organized thing and not just ignorant politicians, being paid to invest money in prisons as opposed to intentionally dumb down education, if this is a legitimate, organized plan to dumb down our youth today, who are the players involved? What's going on here? How's it working?
That's a really good question. And actually, if you trace the origins of this straight back to John Dewey, and John Dewey would not have been able to accomplish what he did accomplish without the help of Horace Mann. Horace Mann is the one who introduced the Prussian mandatory age-segregated government-run school system into the United States. So John Dewey just seized that architecture with the Rockefellers and with his cohorts at Teachers College. But one of the key people here was John D. Rockefeller. John Dewey obviously needed a lot of money to advance this insane or criminal idea, whatever you want to call it. And so he got that. He got millions of dollars, and back then millions of dollars was, some serious money to promote this craziness. And he set up an experimental school, and he helped take over the teachers' colleges. And he worked with a wide array of people. A lot of his colleagues actually had gone to study under Wilhelm Wundt at the University of Leipzig in Germany. This was really the father of behavioral psychology. And so the idea was children are just really biological stimulus response mechanisms. So, they're kind of like animals. They have a stimulus and then they react a certain way. And so we can condition them to act in a certain way. So they kind of continued Dewey's legacy. He took over first the University of Chicago with help from the Rockefellers. He became the chair of the department over there dealing with education and psychology. Then he went to Teachers College at Columbia University, which, as some of your listeners might know, that's probably the leading teachers college in the country today. They really kind of set the bar for the rest of the country. And then these experts, so-called, panned out across the country. He wrote in one of the essays that we reprinted in this book, it was published in 1898, called The Primary Education Fetish, where he said, kids don't need to read. They can learn how to read later in life and whatnot. So he wrote in that essay, we need a psychologists and stuff to come out and say that these ideas make sense. And so Edward Huey Long came along. He was a disciple of John Dewey and Wilhelm Wundt. And he came along and said, hey, let's put a pseudo-scientific basis to this and say that this makes sense from a scientific point of view. And really, one of the big problems they initially ran into when they were promoting this, because they had already been pretty successful in taking over a lot of the major teaching colleges and so forth, but one of the big problems they ran into is that we were in the midst of the Great Depression around that time, in the 20s and the 30s, and the economy was not doing well. And so the government schools didn't really have money to go out and buy all these new whole word method books. But after World War II, when all these resources were available and were freed up from war material to do other things, this started spreading into the government school system. Now, if you trace this up to today, UNESCO is really a key player in all of this. The first chairman of UNESCO, of course, was Julian Huxley, and John Dewey and Julian Huxley actually shared a lot of links together. For example, they were both associated with the American Humanist Association. John Dewey was actually one of the signers of the first Humanist Manifesto. And to give you an idea of this, I don't know whether your listeners are Christian or not, but at the time America was a very Christian nation, and John Dewey understood that if you want to have socialism, communism, collectivism, you need to overthrow that. So he and some of his cohorts came up with the first Humanist Manifesto. And in this manifesto, they say, the universe was not created, and so on and so forth. So Julian Huxley really liked these ideas. Julian Huxley, again, was the first chairman of the newly created UNESCO, which was born after World War II. And from there, UNESCO has been openly and subtly promoting this kind of nonsense all over the world, a lot of it with our tax money here. And then you take it all the way to today, where you have people like Bill Gates, for example. Bill Gates signed an agreement with UNESCO in 2004 to develop a global master curriculum and promote global education technology. And, Bill Gates, of course, is a huge fan of the United Nations. And the United Nations even has something, the UNESCO has something called the World Core Curriculum that they think needs to be taught in every school. And it's thoroughly humanist. It's all inspired by John Dewey's ideas. And UNESCO now has teaching guides, what they recommend all teachers need to know and understand for teaching children. And one of the things that they have in their teaching guides is how to teach reading. And if you look at their methodology for teaching reading, it's basically whole word, and then they add in the word phonics. They say, yeah, you can use a little bit of phonics, but don't rely on phonics. You know, sprinkle it in a little bit afterwards, after you've already taught the kids to memorize all these words and that kind of stuff. And so really that's absolutely useless. So if what we do in the book is we actually do trace it from John Dewey all the way up to the present day, show all the key players involved, and of course the progressive eugenicists were also very crucial in building all this. We have 2 chapters on how John Dewey and his progressive cohorts in education set out to especially dumb down black people. They had, I don't know if you know eugenics, but they believed that black people were inferior, and they justified all this quackery with pseudoscience. Right. So, you know, we go through all of these guys, and we trace the whole history from John Dewey up until today, showing all the players and all their instruments for how they did this.
You know, what comes to mind in some of the stuff that you just talked about, I wrote an article, I guess about a year or 2 ago now, called The De-Education of America, that's up on my site. And I referenced an older article that was written, I can't remember who wrote about it right now, but talking about what the American policy was for the Native American schools in the United States, talking about how, well, you know, we don't want to kill off all the Native Americans, so let's educate, you know, him to a certain point, so he'll be able to be our laborer and do the work basically that we don't want our children to do. And it had this whole agenda of how they were going to re-educate the Native Americans, because it was cheaper and more economical and more beneficial to give them, you know, a Western quote-unquote education, you know, to kind of indoctrinate them. And I just came across something up in Canada. They had a similar thing. Again, the Native American schools, where they wanted to get rid of their natural customs and cultures. So they would ship the kids off for 8 months out of the year to these schools where the kids weren't allowed to speak in their native languages. They separated the brothers and sisters and the tribes. And the kids were beaten. Kids were actually murdered and disappeared. And nobody ever found out where they were. I just had an article that I shared on my social media feeds about it. But it's some of the same stuff. I mean, so people out there listening going, oh, people would never do that. I mean, that was policy back in the day. You know, for these other minority groups, these racially different groups, they were educating them out of existence. You know, in essence.
And is that kind of no doubt about it? And this was all very open. You know, a few generations ago, Dennis. I mean, Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was a huge member of the eugenics movement. This was respectable. This was supposed to be scientific. It was racism was supposed to be scientific, and you know this was commonly accepted knowledge among the progressive movement that hey, you know, other races are inferior, and we need to you know, train them and get them out of the gene pool. Essentially, is what they were trying to do. That's what eugenics means, is, you know, purification of the gene pool. And then Hitler kind of you know, left a bad taste in people's mouths because he was such a maniac and a mass murderer. You know, this was mainstream back then.
Joel, you had I heard you had something to say. Go ahead.
The first thing that I think supports a lot of what Alex is saying is that the Protestant Reformation, one of the hugest aspects of the Protestant Reformation was the movement towards literacy, and it came along hand in hand with the printing press. The powers that were in the European countries under Catholicism, they were able to keep control over large sections of the population, and it was a feudal society. So, but they had the power, and one of the ways that they maintained their power was their priests gave them the mass in Latin, and you weren't encouraged or even able, because literacy was so low and most people didn't know Latin, you weren't encouraged or able to read the scripture or read anything else for that matter in your own language and have what you call freedom of conscience. So the Protestant Reformation, and we're largely founded by offshoots, Protestant offshoots like the Puritans. That's why when Alex says that our literacy rate was so high at the time of our founding, he's right, because that was such a treasured thing, that have your own Bible and have your own ability to read the Bible. And so it does make perfect sense near society, and they may think they have great motives for it. They see all these moving parts, and they want to extend prosperity to every corner. Well, you got to control all these rogue elements, and you got to educate them in the way that is going to maximize efficiency rather than maximize the human conscience. So that's what I know about history that I think is pertinent and relevant to that.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right, Joel. If you look at the very first education law in this country, it was actually in 1647 in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was called the Old Deluder Satan Act, and they said everybody needs to learn how to read because they need to be able to read their script.
We lost them again.
Yeah, we lost them again.
They need to be able to read their scripture, he was going to say.
Yeah.
Come around. It was something that was
Alex, we lost you again. We heard everybody needs to be able to read because they need to read their scripture.
Yeah, and because otherwise, the point of the law was otherwise, if people are ignorant of Scripture, then Satan's going to come around and get up to mischief and no good. And so that's why it was such an emphasis on making sure everybody could learn how to read. And we went from that, before the era of mandatory, ridiculous government schools that Horace Mann introduced, we went from that, where everybody could read, essentially, to today, where we have millions of people graduating who can't even read their high school diplomas. It's a national disgrace.
But there's one thing that I read, and you can tell me whether this is true, but from what I understand, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 90% of our population was agrarian, and they were farmers, or they were working in rural areas doing, things related to agriculture or raising livestock. And in the process of having to, we're having an industrial revolution, these people had to eventually move, and often what would happen is they wouldn't show up on time. They would show up when they felt like it. So in some ways, this was just one could make an argument that some of the engineering that went on in the form of changing the way education happened was simply you need to standardize. You need to teach the children that they need to show up, because you can't run a factory if people aren't showing up.
That's exactly right. Yep, no, that's exactly right. And actually, if you look at what Horace Mann did, he went to Prussia. Horace Mann was the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts. It was the first time this country had ever had a position called Secretary of Education. It was just for the state of Massachusetts. But he went to Prussia, and he studied their system. And basically, the school system in Prussia at that time, it was unique in the world. It was revolutionary.
It was militaristic.
Exactly, and they wanted to indoctrinate the students into obedience, uncritical loyalty to the state under all circumstances, and Horace Mann thought that was great. And so they segregated the students by age, which was totally alien to the American experience. And they said, hey, we're going to set up government-run, taxpayer-funded schools. We're going to segregate the children by age, and we're going to make sure that they all learn obedience to the state and to authority and so on. And John Dewey was able to see, I don't know that Horace Mann wanted to dumb down children. He certainly wanted to make the society more secular. He made the schools more secular. And he certainly also wanted to induce obedience to authority and obedience to the state. Then John Dewey came along and seized this architecture for the purpose of actually dumbing down the students. And what you were saying about, creating good worker bees and so on, that's exactly what a lot of the establishment powerhouses that financed all of this had in mind. That was John D. Rockefeller's motivation here. He wanted, kids who were educated enough to do their pre-assigned tasks, but not educated enough to be critical thinkers and to, really think things through and to have a mind of their own and to be philosophers and writers. He didn't want that. He wanted worker drones who could accomplish their tasks, but not necessarily ask too many questions. And Dewey, he was very explicit about what he wanted. He wanted a collectivist, utopian society with no private property rights and so on. And so the two forces came together, and they said, hey, let's hijack the government school system, and we'll work together on dumbing down the students and creating good worker drones who can't think for themselves. And that it's still going on to this day with Common Core. Common Core is kind of the capstone maybe on all of this until they move to the next step where they just outright tell us that UNESCO is going to be setting the global standards in education, which in a sense they already are.
Alex, a lot. This is all great information, and you just touched on Common Core, and I want to jump into that in just a second. But I want to, ask a question ahead of that. I find, when I speak to colleagues or to parents, or to anybody that'll even remotely listen to me about this stuff, they seem interested, but then when we start going to the depth that you just went into, the eyes kind of gloss over, and they kind of say, oh yeah, that's messed up, and then they don't want to hear any more about it, or they don't, they just kind of lose interest in it. Which is very frustrating because you're trying to sit there and say your kid is being dumbed down and set up for failure right here, but nobody seems to care. So looking at Common Core right now, I mean, do we have a smoking gun that we could give to teachers and to parents and to say, look, this is what you can look at right now as proof that things are not what you believe them to be. Education is not in a good state right now. Could Common Core be that solution?
I think so. And the rebellion against Common Core that's going on right now, I think, is maybe the most encouraging thing that's happened in education in generations. But, the Common Core people themselves provided the evidence that this is all a gigantic fraud that's aimed at dumbing down children. They put together what they call a Common Core Validation Committee. This was the Common Core people who put together this validation committee. So presumably they selected people who they thought would just be rubber stamps. And actually some of the committee members described the committee as a rubber stamp committee. Now on this committee, they selected 2 subject matter experts, one for math, one for English. Both of those experts refused to sign off. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about each one because what they had to say is just mind-blowing. Dr. Sandra Stotsky, who I've interviewed a number of times, and I've spoken with her for some of the articles and for this book as well. She was the English expert. She was the chair of education at the University of Arkansas, and before that she had written the English standards for the state of Massachusetts, and she's been in this for a long time, widely respected even among the education establishment. And so they said, hey, well, take a look at these standards and sign off, say that they're research-based and internationally benchmarked and that these are going to be good for kids or whatever. And she said, no way, these standards are horrible. They're going to reduce the critical thinking abilities of children. And so, no, I'm not going to sign off on them. So that was bad enough. Then you get to the math section. They had one mathematics expert on this validation committee, Dr. James Milgram of Stanford, and he also said, I'm not going to sign off on these standards. They're terrible. They're as unchallenging as possible. They're not clear. And get this, some of them are based on incorrect math. So any person who tells you that we should have these standards across the whole country is either completely ignorant or they are deliberately in favor of rolling out national standards that are going to reduce the critical thinking abilities of children, that are based on incorrect math, that are going to be stripping all the great literature out in favor of reading, executive orders and EPA regulations. So, I consider Common Core really a smoking gun that the education establishment is determined to dumb down America's children. And, there's many smoking guns, but Common Core, I think, is a very relevant one. And, the opposition has just been across the board. Liberals, conservatives, libertarians, statists, teachers' unions, tea parties, everybody is outraged about this, and yet it hangs on. And yet the politicians will not give it up no matter what. And so, clearly there's an agenda here at work, and the agenda is not to educate our children properly.
Right. Well, right. Yeah. And that's. Go ahead, Joel. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say the connection I see is to globalization, and what I think the powers that be that are behind this want is they want monopoly capitalism or corporatism, because if we don't teach our kids to critically think, then they're not going to innovate, and if they don't innovate, they're not going to challenge the multinational corporations and governments that are in bed with each other. So, and that goes right hand in hand with the Walmartization of our country. Yeah. The mom and pop shops being put out of business in favor of these standardized multinational corporations and they need workers. Yeah. And so they will provide the workers. They don't want leaders, because the leaders will through healthy competition, will be able to they'll be able to provide goods and services that are better than the ones that they're providing.
And that's my frustration, is that the corporatization of stuff. I got to be careful with what I say and how I say, because I'm still employed. But I've seen time and time again in the schools, in my experience, moving towards business models, making business-based decisions based on a bottom line, not all in the name of we got to do what's best for our students, but the decisions you're making are what's best for your budget, not your students, and that's very scary for me. I have to stop and ask myself sometimes, is this real, or am I just the crazy one in the group who, because I seem to be one of the few ones shouting about it in every job that I've had? Is this, are the people either that ignorant, or are they that intent on some agenda to really dumb down the kids? I mean, I'm in a state of shock, and even hearing this conversation and the research that you're putting out, Alex, I still have denial, even though I've lived it for the last decade.
Yeah, well, they've created an interesting system of incentive structures here. Like on the one hand, you mentioned the bottom line. One of the things that the Obama administration did, and that Bill Gates did to spread Common Core out across the country, was bribing state governments and local school districts into imposing this. Bill Gates, of course, provided a lot of the financing to develop Common Core and a lot of the financing for propaganda, to promote it, buying off the think tanks and the unions. And the Obama administration, using so-called stimulus money, they bribed, and I think bribe is the appropriate word here, because they're illegitimately using money to pay off our officials to do something that's against our own best interest for the purpose of benefiting special interests. And so they said, hey, school districts, states, you guys are all in big trouble with your budgets. Hey, we are too. We're $18 trillion in debt, but ignore that. We're going to give you lots of billions if you agree to subject your students to this monstrosity called Common Core. And so, administrators at the school system, they were all told, hey, you're going to lose your job if we don't get these federal bailout monies and the race to the top money and so on. And so if you like your job, you better zip your mouth and keep quiet. Other teachers were just outright threatened. I've talked to so many teachers who have told me so many horror stories about what's going on with Common Core, and they try to speak out, and they get punished, they get threatened. In some cases, they get fired. And in some cases, they just have to resign because the terror is just too much.
Yeah, I've been one of those teachers.
How is this connected to No Child Left Behind?
Well, No Child Left Behind really paved the way for this. I mean, and before that, we can even go back to Clinton's Goals 2000, right, where they said they were going to create pseudo-national standards, and they were going to get the Federal Department of Education more deeply involved. Then Bush and, of course, Ted Kennedy actually wrote No Child Left Behind. They came along and they said,
Bush signed off on it.
That's right, exactly. The George W. Bush administration signed it and promoted it. And what they did with the No Child Left Behind is they set up the enforcement mechanism for all of this. They said, you're going to have to start doing tests to show that your students are, learning what the federal government thinks they need to learn, and so on and so forth. And so that's how they really hijacked control of at the national level through the Federal Department of Education, the school system, and then inserting Common Core was really just, kind of a coup de grace, a relatively simple matter once the whole architecture had already been established.
Yeah, and those tests, I talk about those tests constantly about how bad they are. When I came into teaching, it was 2008, and what these tests have done is they create really a false set of data saying, your school's good enough, your school's not good enough. They don't look at all the external factors and needs and challenges that those schools are facing. And it affects the funding that the school gets. It affects the amount of government control and intervention that these schools get. And in the long run, it's shutting some of these schools down. And they use these tests as that evidence, that quote-unquote evidence.
It's pseudoscience.
Yes.
Like he talking about science. Like, science is very useful, but science is used as propaganda, and law enforcement is used. Like, if you push all the crime indoors, suddenly there's no crime, or there's no moral problems that precede the crime, or there's no health problems that precede crime because you clean up the exterior. Oh, our stats are down.
Right. And that's what's going on in the schools. I mean, in the schools that I was in, especially in Philadelphia, it's such a corrupt school district. Crimes, not just violations of the school code of conduct. Like, I'm talking sexual assaults that would happen in the schools that I was in would get covered up, would get swept under the rug. And I've been called on the carpet several times. I've had my job threatened. I've had to have my union reps come in. And I'm sitting there going, you can't do this. This is illegal. And and they say, well, the kid said that you hit him. So how do you want to play this now, Mr. Knapp? It just goes on from there.
Oh my goodness.
They don't want these. Yeah, I mean, it's all in my first book, Service, talking about these incidents that happened. They don't want those numbers to look bad because then their school, all this pressure comes down on the schools, and then their jobs are threatened. But as educators, we take these jobs to advocate for our children, and what I've seen time and time again as administrators and even teachers, they sell out when pressure's put on them. And in reality, shame on all of you, out there who have done that, because you're giving up our future and you're ruining our future. And I had the utmost respect for teachers that come out there and fight the good fight every day, but those that sit there and smile and say, yeah, we're going to rate test scores, that's our focus, we're going to teach you the test, you need to get out of education, or you need to have a voice and a backbone. That's my honest opinion.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you, Dennis. And, you know, the testing regime really serves a number of crucial purposes for the broader agenda here of globalizing and standardizing education worldwide. I mean, if you don't have the test, the federal government has no way of knowing whether all the government schools are teaching what the federal government wants taught. And so in that sense, the tests are a crucial enforcement mechanism. They make sure that the kids are learning what the government wants them to learn, which, as we already discussed, is propaganda, indoctrination, dumbing down, etc. It makes sure that the teachers, even the ones who really want to buck the system, that they have to teach to the Common Core and they have to teach the dumbing down and the indoctrination, because if not, their students are going to do bad on the test and they're going to get in trouble. And they serve as data gathering tools on the students. Now, right now, that we have a whole chapter in the book about how the federal government is creating huge dossiers on every government school child in this country. And, you know, they don't want to just know academic stuff, what your grades are like, that kind of stuff. They want to know political views, attitudes, psychiatric health, psychological health, you know, how many teeth they have in their mouth. What are their views on homosexual marriage? What are their views on abortion? Have they had anal sex by the time they're 12? I mean, this kind of stuff is, you know, Big Brother, Orwell nightmare on steroids, and it's happening right in front of our faces.
Wow. Now, how are they getting that? I mean, is that through the counselors, or is that getting put in? Because I haven't come across that level of stuff. I mean, I see data with the standardized tests that comes through, you know, and I was frustrated with the way that as these children are taking these tests, they have to read legal disclaimers threatening to send them to prison for cheating on a test, or doing, you know, or sharing the test, or taking out their cell phone. I mean, they're threatening kids with jail time for taking a test. They shouldn't have to be exposed to that. But, you know, what's the mechanism using to collect this data?
Well, the Common Core tests gather a ton of information in and of themselves. A lot of this stuff is kind of behavioral information. They gather information based on the students' answers to certain things.
Okay, so they're looking at the data, the answers then.
Oh yeah, exactly. And then beyond that, just 2 days ago, it came out that schools in Massachusetts were handing out a federal survey to 12-year-old children, asking them how many people they've had sex with. Really leading questions: have they had anal sex? Have they had oral sex? Have they been using drugs? You know, all kinds of stuff. And the way that these questions were written, first of all, this is way beyond anything the government should even contemplate knowing. And second of all, the way the questions were written, it's almost designed to make a 12-year-old be like, oh, well, you haven't had sex with 6 people. What's wrong with you? All your peers are doing that. And it's part of the sexualization agenda. But on the data gathering, they have 400 data points that they're trying to collect now. And one of the things we did for the book also, we looked through some of the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education's documents, and some of the tools that they're developing and some of the tools that are already in use to gather information. I mean, you would be shocked and appalled. They have, for just as one example, there's a U.S. Department of Education report about promoting grit, tenacity, and perseverance. And they talk about a tool that they have. It's already being used in tutoring programs funded by the U.S. Department of Education. It examines the facial reactions of students to different stimuli, and from that it can decode what a student's reaction is to certain things. So say they're talking about homosexuals in the classroom, or transgenderism, or drugs, or abortions, or whatever it is. They can use these types of tools to analyze a child's reactions to what's being talked about. Now, this is just insane that the government is even contemplating this stuff, let alone gathering this kind of data. And it's going to keep getting worse and worse and worse as long as people don't put their foot down and say, hey, enough is enough now.
So I want to keep going with this for hours. Maybe we could do another discussion one night, Alex, when you have some time. But we're coming up towards the end of our show, because I know you have to be out of here in the next few minutes. So let's get into, in the next 5 minutes, what's the takeaway here? What can be done right now by parents, by students, by teachers, by administrators? What do we need done to make this change? Because this is this is one of the most serious things threatening, I think, our country and this world right now is the destruction of education. So what can we do?
Yeah, first of all, I couldn't agree with you more. The reason I'm so passionate about education is because education is our future. We're now living in a society where we've had several generations of Americans being dumbed down. So, the consequences are all around us. Our society is falling apart. Our government is out of control. And if this continues, we're going to lose our country, we're going to lose our liberties, we're going to lose our Constitution, we're going to lose our sovereignty, and we're going to be moving toward a very dark period in human history. And I mean that absolutely seriously, no hyperbole. The designs of these people and their ultimate objectives are, dark beyond imagination, and they need to be resisted. So as to what we can do about it, the first thing I tell people, if you can, and if you can't find a way to be able to, get your kids out of the government schools. It's sad that we have to pay for them with our taxes and take our kids out, but hey, what's being done to them is deliberate dumbing down. It's sexualization at younger and younger ages. It's data gathering. Your kids deserve better. I mean, your kids are the future. The most important decision you're going to make for their lives is what kind of education they're going to get. So if you can, get them out of the government schools. If you can't, find a way to get them out of the government schools. Everybody can do it somehow. I know single parents who homeschool. It's possible. Everybody can find a way of doing it. There's cheap resources out there, online services, homeschool co-ops, good Christian schools, good private schools. You can get scholarship, all kinds of stuff like that. So that's the first and most immediate concern, is protect your children from this lunacy. And beyond that, though, we can't let this stuff continue. We first of all need to protect our own kids, but beyond that, we have an obligation, I think, as citizens of this country, to take an interest in what's happening, and even just from a self-preservation point of view, this is all clearly going toward a very negative direction. We're going to lose our country. We're going to lose our freedom, and so we have to do something. And I would say we need to seize on the outrage about Common Core to raise awareness about what's going on. And, the Common Core rebellion is spreading, and I don't think the establishment has even gotten a handle on this yet. And it's going to keep growing. The opt-out from the test, the teachers' unions defecting. A lot of states now are considering withdrawing. Some have pretended to withdraw only to rename them, so we need to be on guard for that. But really, we need to revamp the school system from top to bottom. Abolish the Federal Department of Education. It's unconstitutional, and it's been a terrible, terrible.
Lost you again for a minute, Alex. Not sure if you're still with us.
Educational control that will do what we know works. Teach using phonics. Teach using traditional math. Teach science. Offer different perspectives. Train children to be critical thinkers. And the most important thing is that the kids can read, because if they can read, they can rescue themselves, right? They can acquire information independently of the school system, of the media. They can read books. They can read their Bible, their Constitution, their history, their science, whatever it is. They don't need to rely on the government and the establishment media, which, as far as I'm concerned, is mostly lies, to acquire information. So those are the things I tell people that I think we can do and we need to do if we're going to save this country and save the kids.
A lot of great points. I mean, and to me, that's the revolution. You don't got to get violent. You don't even have to get in the streets and protest with stuff like this. If everybody would just refuse to take these tests, that would send a huge message. That would be so empowering for the students, for the parents, and for the teachers that are actually out there carrying to fight that fight. And another thing that I talk about on my shows and my books, I say, to the teachers out there, when you're in that classroom, you have to teach certain things, even if you're being forced to teach Common Core. You have those moments when the doors close and it's just you and your students. Have those conversations. Have these conversations. I still, when I have opportunities to talk with students, I talk about this type of stuff with them and say, hey, the world doesn't want you educated, and the kids usually like to goof off and not get involved. Once I get real with them and tell them, hey, this is what's happening, they change. And all of a sudden they start trying to better themselves and learn to read, because they realize what's being taken from them is that opportunity. So a lot of good points on there, Alex. We're drawing to the close of our show. Let me give Joel a quick 2 minutes if he has any final thoughts before we'll kick it to you, Alex, for your last statements.
First thing I thought of when he started talking about the ways we teach kids how to read is I remember learning how to read. And I think about this connection between how we talk about we spell a word with letters to make the word, but we also, what is a spell? A spell is magic, and the ability to put words together to understand, and then understand how they go into sentences, and then understand how the sentences go into paragraphs and into books. That's like that's a key. That's like it's key to so much power. And I was taught to critically think around ideas from that first birth. So the power, is given to our children to think for themselves when we teach them the basics, and then from there we allow them to explore their own way. Other point I wanted to make was real quick was the de-Christianization of America, and trust me, I feel like there's a lot wrong, and there has been a lot wrong with the dominant Christian thinking. It's held a lot of things back. But on the other hand, I was talking about how the Catholics in the Middle Ages, they held everybody back. But at the same time, there were sects. There was the Jesuits. There was the Dominicans who were dedicated to what we would call social justice, just to moral justice, and to schools and to education. And the Catholics popularly have gotten such a bad rap because of some of the bad things that have happened. But you never hear about all the good work the Catholics have been doing with their schools and with their charities throughout this country, throughout our history. And Alex mentioned Christian schools too. And it's just now it's like this. We get this idea that Christianity, religion is bad, but and there was some bad things about it. But now we've turned to the government and to the powers that be, and we're making them an idol, making them a god.
Yeah.
And people aren't thinking for themselves because they think, oh, the government will take care of that. The police will take care of that.
Yep.
The teachers will take care of that. And
they give away their
people
power.
aren't thinking for themselves.
Right, and they're giving away their power. They're saying
Yes.
somebody else will handle it, somebody else will deal with it, and you are being powerless when you're doing that. A lot of great points, Joel. Laura, we got about a minute before I got to kick it back to Alex. Any thoughts, anything you want to say? I know you're out there in social media tweeting away for us.
Yeah, I mean, this conversation has just made me reflect. I've had some experience working with kids in Philadelphia public schools that, their whole education is towards standardized tests, and they can't write a sentence, and they're almost afraid if you give them a creative project.
They are afraid.
They don't, that kind of independent thinking is scary to them, and it just made me think of those kids, and I think it's almost more terrifying when you see it firsthand than just reading about it. But I thought this was such a great discussion. I'm so glad we had Alex on. It was really just informative, and just thank you.
Awesome, Lori. Thanks for that. Alex, got about a minute left. Anything else before we cut you loose?
Hey, well, thank you guys so much again for having me. I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed hearing about you guys' experiences in dealing with the effects of this. And let's do it again sometime. And I'm looking forward to reading your book, Dennis. I hope you'll get a copy of Crimes of the Educators and take a look as well. And keep up the great work, guys. I really appreciate what you guys are doing. And we got to do it. It's our country. It's our kids. We got to save them, or somebody else is not going to do it without us. So.
Well said, my friend. Hey, how can they get your book? Where is it available?
People can go on, if they want autographed copies, the publisher sells them at superstore.wnd.com. Otherwise, they can be purchased on Amazon and Walmart, Barnes, and all the big retailers are carrying it, at least online. I don't know about in their physical stores, but
right.
Just Crimes of the Educators, and then the subtitle is How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children.
Send me some links. I'll have them up in the show notes, and any contact information, anything you want for our listeners, I'll put that up in our show notes on serviceofchange.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dennis.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we're going to close out the show. Alex, give me 1 second. We'll touch base as soon as we close it out. We're just about done. But to our listeners out there, thank you so much. Please, again, check out Alex's book, Crimes of the Educators. Check out my book, Service of Soldier's Journey, Counterintelligence, Law Enforcement, and the Violence of Urban Education. Lots of good stuff at serviceofchange.com. That's all the time we have this evening. Please remember that small changes among the masses can have a massive impact around the world. Be that change. Thank you.